A lab technician in a climate-controlled room in Oregon stared at a number on a screen and figured the machine had glitched. The date was simply too old. It didn't fit anything the textbooks allowed for, and the correct professional instinct, the careful one, was to distrust it. So they ran the test again. New sample, new prep, a different pair of hands to rule out contamination. Same number. They ran it a third time, on an entirely separate machine, calibrated by an entirely separate team. And the answer refused to budge, sitting there like a stone lodged in a riverbed. Every path led back to the same impossible place. The people who had lived on that gravel terrace above the Salmon River had been there roughly 16,000 years ago, 1,000, maybe 3,000 years before the first Americans were even supposed to exist. Sit with that, because it does not fit inside the sentence generations of students were taught to recite by heart. For most of the 20th century, if you asked who the first Americans were, there was one clean, confident answer. They were called the Clovis people. They arrived at a specific time, by a specific route, carrying a specific weapon, and spread across an empty continent like water, finding every low place. It was tidy. It was teachable. You could sketch the whole thing with a single arrow on a map, and it was wrong. Not slightly wrong, not wrong around the edges, but wrong at the foundation. A whole field spent the better part of 70 years defending it anyway. To understand how badly that story eventually broke, you first have to understand how solid it once looked. It starts, like so many origin stories do, in the dust of the American Southwest. In 1932, near a windswept town called Clovis, New Mexico, at a site known as Blackwater Draw, a local man named James Whiteman began noticing something odd washing out of the ground. Worked stone, not the rounded, accidental shapes that time and erosion carve out of any rock, but blades, deliberate, shaped, unmistakably the product of human hands. Whiteman kept finding more, and the discoveries eventually caught the attention of a professional archaeologist, Edgar Howard, who led the first systematic dig at the site. What came out of that ground would go on to define an entire discipline. The tools had a signature, a fingerprint no natural process could replicate. Down the center of each spear point on both faces ran a long channel. A flake struck off the base to thin the point so it could be lashed onto a shaft. Archaeologists call these fluted points, and the flute is really the whole story. It's brutally difficult to make, requiring real skill and carrying a high failure rate. Snap the point at the wrong instant, and hours of work shatter in your hand. But the truly electrifying part wasn't the flute itself. It was what these points were lying next to. They turned up, tangled among the bones of animals that no longer walk the earth. Mammoths, ancient bison, the vanished megafauna of the Ice Age. Here was undeniable, thrilling proof that human beings had hunted those giants. People had stood on this continent while mammoths still drew breath. Radiocarbon dating, which arrived not long after, put a number on it. Clovis dated to roughly 13,000 years before present, and around that single number, a beautiful, self-contained story assembled itself. So satisfying it felt less like a hypothesis, and more like something everyone had simply always known. The story went like this. During the last ice age, so much of the planet's water was locked into ice sheets that sea levels dropped, and where the Bering Strait now separates Siberia from Alaska, dry land emerged. This was Beringia. Not the narrow bridge the schoolroom illustrations always implied, but a vast, cold, livable grassland roughly 600 miles wide. Animals crossed it, and behind the animals, following the herds, came people, walking out of Asia into the northwestern corner of a continent no human had ever seen. But there was a problem, and the problem was ice. 2 enormous ice sheets sat across the top of North America. The Laurentide, sprawling out of the east, and the Cordilleran, grinding down out of the western mountains. Where they met, they sealed the continent shut. A person could stand in Alaska and go no further because a wall of ice hundreds of miles thick blocked every route south. So the story needed a door. And the door in this model was an ice-free corridor, a narrow ribbon of livable land that opened up between the 2 retreating ice sheets sometime around 13 to 14,000 years ago. The timing was perfect, almost suspiciously perfect. The corridor opened, and out through it poured the Clovis people into a warm, unguarded continent teeming with game, multiplying and spreading coast to coast in what felt, in the telling, like a single triumphant generation. Clean, teachable, 1 arrow on a map. 1. And here's the seductive part. The reason it held for so long. The timing lined up. Clovis dated to 13,000 years. The corridor opened around 13 to 14,000 years. The math closed the loop perfectly. The first tools appeared exactly when the only available door swung open. What more could you ask for? What you'd want, if you were being honest, is for someone to eventually find something older. For decades, the official answer was that no one ever had, or more precisely, that no one had who could survive the scrutiny. Because Clovis-first didn't stay a mere theory. It hardened into a filter, a gate, a rule about what evidence was even allowed to count as real. Any archaeologist who claimed to have found signs of people older than Clovis walked straight into a buzzsaw. Their dates got questioned, their stratigraphy got picked apart, their stones got dismissed as accidents of geology, and the bar they were held to wasn't the bar Clovis sites themselves had ever needed to clear. It was higher, sometimes absurdly so, calibrated less to find the truth than to keep the existing story intact. There was even a nickname for the enforcers, whispered at first and then said out loud in the field, the Clovis Police. The most formidable among them was a geoscientist at the University of Arizona, a rigorous, genuinely skilled skeptic whose caution had, for a long time, served the discipline well, because most extraordinary claims really are wrong, and somebody has to be willing to say so. But rigor curdles into something else entirely once it stops being a tool for finding truth and becomes a wall for defending a conclusion. Careers bent under that pressure. Reputations took bruises. Younger researchers quietly learned that arguing for a pre-Clovis date was a fast way to get exiled from serious conversation. And the story stood, unbroken and gleaming, taught to every child with a map and an arrow, right up until the ground itself started arguing back. The first real crack didn't even come from North America. It came from the bottom of the world, from a boggy stretch of southern Chile where a creek called Chinchihuapi wound through cold, waterlogged ground. The site was called Monte Verde, and the man who staked his career on it was an American archaeologist, working far from home, patient and stubborn in equal measure. What made Monte Verde extraordinary wasn't just its age, but its preservation. Most ancient sites give you stone and bone, the parts that survive, because almost nothing else can. Monte Verde gave up things that should have rotted away millennia ago. A layer of peat had sealed the site into an airless, waterlogged tomb, and inside that tomb, time had essentially stopped. Consider what came out of that mud. Wooden tent stakes still standing upright, the remains of hide-covered shelters, knotted cords of plant fiber tied by human fingers, chewed leaves of a medicinal plant, as if someone had pressed them against an aching tooth and spat them out. Preserved in the soft ground, researchers even found what looked like a child's footprint beside a hearth. Not a stone that might be a tool, not a fracture that might be an accident. A footprint. There's something staggering in the intimacy of that. A small human being standing at the edge of a fire in a world the textbooks insisted no one had reached yet. Radiocarbon dating placed the main occupation at roughly 14,500 years before present, more than 1,000 years older than Clovis. Not a rounding error, not a margin you could shrug off over coffee. A full millennium sitting there in the peat, refusing to disappear. For years, the Clovis establishment did exactly what it had always done. They questioned the stratigraphy. They wondered aloud about contamination, about old carbon, about whether the wood had really been worked or merely weathered by time. The pressure was relentless, and to be fair, it was precisely the pressure good science is supposed to apply, because if Monte Verde was wrong, the field needed to know before tearing up 70 years of consensus. So in 1997, something almost unheard of happened. A committee of senior archaeologists, several of them longtime skeptics with every professional reason to want the site debunked, traveled to Chile to see it for themselves. They walked the ground. They examined the artifacts. They interrogated the layers. And when they came home, they did the hardest thing a scientist can do. They changed their minds. The committee endorsed the dates. Monte Verde was real. It was pre-Clovis. And with that single site, the wall that had stood for 70 years developed its first genuine fracture, one that would never close again. This is the part of the story worth sitting with, because it's the part any conspiracy-flavored retelling gets wrong. The system did eventually work. Skeptics went, looked, and admitted they'd been beaten by the evidence. That isn't suppression. It's science doing the slow, unglamorous, honorable thing it's actually built to do. But here's the harder truth. It took a foreign site, preserved by a freak of chemistry, complete with an actual footprint, to force that admission. On weaker evidence, at an ordinary site, that door would have stayed shut. Which tells you something about exactly how tightly it had been held. Because here's what one crack does. It doesn't just weaken a single point in the wall. It tells everyone else quietly sitting on a strange result that they aren't crazy. All across the continent, researchers had data they'd learned to keep to themselves. Dates that ran too old, layers that sat too deep, stones nobody wanted to take seriously. Monte Verde gave them permission to speak up. One is a fluke, two is a pattern, and now a third, a fourth were about to arrive. From wildly different places, which is exactly what made them impossible to explain away. If every anomaly had shown up at one strange site, you could blame the site. But these turned up thousands of miles apart, dug by different teams, dated with different methods, and they all pointed the same direction, backward, past the wall, into deep time. In the Florida Panhandle, under the tea-colored water of a river sinkhole, Divers, working in near total darkness, recovered stone tools alongside the butchered bones of a mastodon. A tusk bore what looked like cut marks, the traces of a blade separating meat from bone. The layer they came from was sealed and undisturbed, and when it was dated, the number landed around 14,550 years before present. Underwater, protected from any churn at the surface, the site had kept its secrets in perfect order. There was no plausible way for younger material to have slipped down into that layer. It was as clean a case as you could ask for, and it was older than Clovis. Then came Oregon, in a set of dry rock shelters called the Paisley Caves, where researchers found something even harder to argue with than a stone. They found human waste, desiccated coprolites, preserved by the arid cave air for thousands of years, and crucially, they found human DNA inside them. You can debate whether a rock was shaped by hands. You cannot debate whether something came out of a human body. The coprolites dated to around 14,300 years before present, and the genetic material tied them unmistakably to people, not animals. Skeptics tried the Uili contamination argument. Maybe modern DNA had seeped downward. So the team ran control after control testing for exactly that kind of leakage, and the ancient signal held firm. Another site, another method, another 1,000+ years past the wall. In central Texas, at a site called Gault, the picture got stranger still. Beneath the familiar Clovis layers, because Clovis was there too, right where it should be, excavators kept digging into older sediment and kept finding tools. Not fluted Clovis points, but something different, something earlier, the assemblages. From those deeper layers, pushed the range back to somewhere between 16,000 and, by some estimates, 20,000 years before present. Read that again. 20,000. That isn't 1,000 years before Clovis. That's a chasm, a depth that made Monte Verde look almost recent by comparison. Each of these sites alone could have been argued over for a generation. Together, they formed something the Clovis police simply couldn't fire on. A pattern with independent legs, different states, different dating chemistries, different categories of evidence, bone, DNA, stone, all converging on the same conclusion. And it was into this shifting, uncertain landscape that a quiet terrace above an Idaho river was about to deliver the number that would finally end the argument. Which brings the story back to Cooper's Ferry, to archaeologist Lauren Davis, and to that terrace on the lower Salmon River where all of this began. Because by the time Davis was ready to publish, he had something the other sites, for all their power, didn't quite have in the same form. He had a settlement, not a single kill site, not a scatter of stone, but a place where people had returned again and again to live. And he had a stack of radiocarbon dates from the deepest occupation layer that, when they came back from the lab, must have made him read the printout twice. The lowest horizon at Cooper's Ferry dated between 15,300 and 16,560 calendar years before present. Sit with the top of that range, 16,500 years. That's more than 3,000 years older than the wall Clovis-first had built and defended for 7 decades. And it wasn't one date pulled from one ambiguous sample. It was a series drawn from charcoal and ancient hearths, layered in a sequence that made geological sense. Older material below, younger above, exactly as undisturbed sediment should stack. No shuffling of layers, no younger carbon bleeding downward. The oldest dates sat at the bottom, sealed beneath everything that came after, precisely where the Earth's own logic said they belonged. Now hold that number up against the map of the ice, because this is the part that doesn't just bend the Clovis model, it makes it physically impossible. 16,000 years ago, the 2 great ice sheets that Beringian migrants were supposed to have threaded between were still fused together. The Laurentide sheet spreading out of eastern Canada and the Cordilleran sheet riding the western mountains still met in the middle. A continuous wall of ice sealing the continent's interior shut. The famous ice-free corridor that hopeful arrow traced down the middle of Canada in every textbook diagram did not exist yet. It wouldn't. Open for another 2,000 or 3,000 years. So the people warming themselves by those fires on the Salmon River terrace could not have walked down the corridor. The corridor was closed, buried under a mile of ice. They were already south of a barrier that, according to the reigning model, hadn't even been breached yet. That's the detail worth pausing on. The Clovis model wasn't merely too young. It described a route that was still sealed shut while these people were living, cooking, and napping stone in Idaho. The story didn't just have the wrong date, it had the wrong door. And the tools they left behind told the same subversive story a second way. The points recovered from those deep layers weren't fluted. They didn't carry that elegant channel scar down the face that defines a Clovis point. Instead, they had stemmed bases, narrowed at the bottom, shaped to be hafted onto a shaft using an entirely different tradition. Archaeologists call it the Western Stem tradition, and across the Northwest and the Great Basin, it keeps turning up older than Clovis, not younger. Think about what that implies. If Clovis technology had spread out from one founding population, fanning across the continent, you'd expect to find Clovis sitting beneath everything, the ancestral form that everything else descended from. Instead, out west, a different toolkit occupies the older layers, made by people, using a method Clovis knappers simply didn't use. This wasn't one tradition evolving into another. It looked like different people, arriving by a different path, carrying a different idea of how to make a blade entirely. There's an intimacy in those stemmed points that's easy to lose under the weight of the dates. Someone knelt on that terrace, pressing flake after flake off a core, feeling for the grain of the stone the way a woodworker feels for the grain of a board. Someone narrowed a base with careful, practiced pressure so it would seat snugly against a wooden shaft bound with sinew, ready for the hunt. These weren't crude objects. They were the confident work of people who'd been making tools this way for generations, who had inherited a technique and refined it, which raises the obvious question. Inherited it from whom, from where, and how far back does that inheritance actually run before it reaches this terrace? Davis published the first wave of these results in August 2019 in the journal Science, the same gate-kept pages where consensus archaeology has always announced itself to the world. Then, in 2022, a follow-up paper in Science Advances refined the chronology further, tightening the dates and closing off whatever escape routes a determined skeptic might still have tried to squeeze through. This wasn't one lucky measurement anyone could wave off as a fluke. It was a carefully built architecture of evidence, stress-tested and retested, laid out in the open for the entire field to attack. And this time, the field couldn't knock it down. But there's a part of the Cooper's Ferry story the dates alone don't capture. The part that turns a scientific correction into something closer to a reckoning. The lower Salmon River sits within the ancestral territory of the Nimi-Poo, the people known in English as the Nez Perce. And the Nimi-Poo had been telling anyone who would listen for well over a century that their connection to that land ran far deeper than outside science was willing to admit. Generation after generation, they told researchers their ancestors had been there since time out of memory, a past so distant it lived only in story and song. For 100 years, that testimony was treated as a different category of knowing, oral tradition, folklore, something respected on a museum placard but kept carefully separate from the hard numbers of radiocarbon and stratigraphy. And then the hard numbers arrived, and they agreed. The documented archaeology, with its charcoal dates and sealed layers and peer-reviewed pages, landed exactly where the Nimi-Poo had been pointing all along. The oral tradition had been carrying an accurate memory across so many generations that the science simply took a century to catch up. There's something humbling in that. The realization that a way of knowing the establishment had quietly discounted turned out to hold a truth the establishment's own methods would only later confirm. So consider where the pattern stood by then. Monte Verde in Chile, 14,000 years, accepted after a formal review. Page-Ladson in Florida, older still, sealed beneath a river. Paisley Caves in Oregon, human DNA past the wall. Gault in Texas, tools reaching back 16, maybe 20,000 years. And now Cooper's Ferry, a settlement in Idaho, occupied while the corridor south was still choked with ice, built on a toolkit that had never been Clovis at all. 5 sites, 5 methods, 5 independent legs, holding up the same impossible conclusion. And remarkably, even that wasn't the deepest number the ground still had to give, because while archaeologists argued over stone tools and charcoal, another team was working in a very different kind of dirt, soft, ancient mud on the edge of what had once been a shallow lake in New Mexico. And what they found there didn't need a single artifact to make its case. It needed only footprints. The tracks were pressed into an old lake bed at White Sands, layer upon layer of them, impressions of human feet that had walked across wet ground and then been buried and preserved for an almost unthinkable span of time. Some were the broad, flat prints of adults. Others were smaller, and among them were the tiny prints of children so light on the surface that you could read, in the spacing between steps, the exact moment a child broke into a run. Sit with that for a second. Not a tool that might have been shaped by a river, not a bone that might have cracked from a falling stone. A child running on a specific afternoon, leaving a trail you can still trace across the mud today. There's no geological debate here, no argument about whether nature merely made something look like a person had passed through. Nature doesn't have feet. A researcher specializing in ancient footprints led a team that published the findings in a major journal in 2021, and the number attached to them stopped the field cold. The tracks were dated using seeds from a common aquatic plant found in the layers directly above and below the prints, seeds that had grown, died, and been sealed into that same mud. Those seeds returned an age of roughly 21 to 23,000 years before present. Read that twice? Because it doesn't sit comfortably in the same sentence as anything Clovis-first ever taught. Not 13,000, not 16,000, 21 to 23,000. A time when the great ice sheets weren't retreating but expanding, when the world was locked in the coldest depths of the last glacial maximum, when the corridor south wasn't just closed, it didn't even exist as an idea yet. And of course, the objection came exactly as it always had. Critics argued that the seeds came from a type of plant known to draw old carbon out of the water it grows in, which could artificially push a radiocarbon date deeper than it should go. It was a fair scientific challenge, the good kind, the kind that makes a finding stronger by forcing it to prove itself. So the team went back. In a follow-up study a couple of years later, they redated the same layers using two entirely independent methods that had nothing to do with the seeds or their carbon. They dated ancient pollen from land plants, and they used luminescence dating, a technique that measures how long buried mineral grains have sat hidden from sunlight. 3 separate lines of evidence, 3 different clocks, and all of them landed inside the same window. The footprints held. This is the hardest kind of anchor to fake. You can question a stone. You can question a date drawn from a single material. But when the ground hands you the physical impressions of human beings, and 3 unrelated methods agree on when those people walked, the escape routes close one by one until none are left. Someone was standing on the shore of that lake watching a child run across the flats, at least 21,000 years ago. And that single fact doesn't just stretch the Clovis timeline, it shatters what was left of it. So let's be honest about where this leaves the map, and let's keep the credibility gradient intact, because that honesty is the whole point. Clovis-first is dead. That's not a fringe opinion or a provocation, it's the settled position of the field. No serious archaeologist today stands up to defend the idea that the Clovis people were the first Americans, or that everyone arrived through a single ice-free corridor 13,000 years ago. The consensus that ruled for 70 years, that filled the textbooks and the museum dioramas, that ended careers for the crime of disagreeing with it, is finished. Some of the sites in this story are rock solid, accepted by nearly everyone. Others, further out on the timeline, are still being argued over in exactly the way good science argues things out. That argument isn't suppression, it's the system working. But the overall direction is no longer in doubt. The Clovis hunters standing at the front of every museum exhibit were not the pioneers who opened up a continent. They were latecomers, arriving thousands of years after people had already spread across the land, which forces a rethinking of nearly everything built on the old foundation. The tools at Cooper's Ferry belong to what's called the Western stem tradition, points with narrowed stemmed bases rather than the fluted bases that define Clovis. And that tradition appears to be older in the Northwest than Clovis ever was, hinting at different populations arriving in different waves rather than one clean migration. Some researchers have pointed to an intriguing resemblance between those stemmed points and much older ones found across the Pacific in Japan, pairing that observation with the idea of a coastal route, a kelp highway rich in food that could have carried seafaring people down the western edge of the Americas long before any inland corridor ever thawed. It's a compelling picture, and it's still being tested, still being dug up. That's exactly as it should be. But maybe the deepest lesson here is the simplest one. The Nimipu were right. They said their people had been on that river since time out of memory, and the establishment's own instruments eventually proved it. A whole system that treated indigenous oral tradition as a lesser way of knowing discovered a century. Too late that it had been carrying the truth all along. The question of when and how the first people reached the Americas isn't closed. It's wide open again, more open than it's been in a lifetime. And every field season seems to push it further back into a past nobody saw coming. So here's what I want to know from you. If people were watching their children run across a New Mexico lake bed 21,000 years ago, when the ice was at its worst and the corridor was still nothing more than a fantasy, how do you think they actually got here? The coastal kelp highway? By boat? An even earlier crossing we haven't found yet? Something we haven't even thought to look for? Drop your theory in the comments. Tell me which of these sites convinced you and which one you're still skeptical of. And if you want to be here when the next impossible date comes out of the ground, because it will, go ahead and subscribe. The next dig is already underway.